Many times when we're going through a wilderness experience, all we can see is the stresses and the struggles we're dealing with at the moment. We fail to see how God can use wilderness experiences in our lives to refine and to reform us, forgetting that down through the ages, precious metals were purified by adding heat, which forced the impurities to come to the surface where they could be skimmed off and it became more pure. In the tempering of steel, steel is put into a hot furnace, and then it's brought out and it's pounded, and then it's put into a cooling, like a water bath. Then it's put later on into a furnace again, and then it's pounded, and the process is continued in order to harden it and to make it able to hold a sharp edge. Such was the experience of a man by the name of Jacob, recorded for us in the first book of the Bible, Genesis, chapters 25 to 35. Now, we don't have time in this video to go into his full story, but I'd encourage you to read all 11 chapters. It has so much to teach us. Ultimately, Jacob's story is one of a lifelong struggle to get God's blessing. Let me say that again. Jacob's story is one of a lifelong struggle to get God's blessing. Along the way, he wandered into a wilderness of struggle against all the different people he met. His brother he struggled with his father, he struggled with his uncle, he even struggled with God himself. Yet if we look carefully at his story, we will see in the ways that God worked with Jacob throughout his wilderness experiences, that he was refining and reforming Jacob into a man who truly honored God and was blessed by God. It seems Jacob was was a person who came out of the womb struggling. We would say he was a born fighter. As the second born of a set of twins, he came out holding on to the ankle of his brother who was coming ahead of him. As a result, they named him Jacob, which means he grasps the heel. Now, unfortunately, that term was one that you used when you called somebody a person who grasps the heel. That was the same thing as saying you're a deceiver. You're a person who takes advantage of people. Can you imagine hearing, hey, deceiver, every time your name was called? But Jacob lived up to his name. Whatever his circumstances, he was always trying to figure out how he could work things to his own advantage. We see this first in his relationship with his older brother Esau. As the firstborn, Esau was entitled to the lion's share of their father's estate when he died, along with his father's greatest blessings. Esau was actually also his father's favorite. You see, he was a rugged outdoorsman. In Genesis chapter 25, verse 28, we're told that Isaac, that's their father, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau over Jacob. Jacob was considered the mama's boy. Now, not content to take this lying down, Jacob took advantage of Esau's exhaustion and hunger on one particular day, agreeing to give him something to eat only if Esau agreed to give him, Jacob, Esau's birthright. That's the instrument that entitled Esau to the largest portion of their father's inheritance. Then later, when Isaac, their father, became blind, Jacob conspired with his mother Rebekah to deceive his father into giving him Esau's blessing as well in Genesis chapter 27. He had his mom cook a special meal that tasted like game while Esau was out hunting. And then he took that meal to Isaac dressed in Esau's clothing that smelled like the outdoors. And Rebekah had helped him cover his hands and the back of his neck with goat's hair because, you see, Esau was quite hairy and Isaac was smooth-skinned. His father was confused by his voice when he said, "Who is it?" And he said, "It's Esau." But he says, "It doesn't sound like Esau's voice. Come near me." And when he bent down, he smelled. He said, "Yes, it smells like Esau." And then when he came near to give him the food, his father reached up and touched him and he said, "Ah, it is Esau." Because of these deceptions, along with 3 lies that Jacob told, Isaac ended up giving Esau's blessing to Jacob. Now, unsurprisingly, like most people who've been taken advantage of, Esau didn't take that very well. In fact, he planned to kill his brother once his father had died. So Jacob and his mother came up with a pretext that would allow him to get out of town until Esau's anger had blown over. And like so many people who feel that they've gotten away with something, Jacob still thought that he was in control of things. Sure, he had to flee for his life, but when he stopped for rest on that first night, he had a dream. He dreamed of he dreamt of a stairway that started on the earth and went all the way up to heaven. And at the very top, he saw God standing there. And in his dream, God blessed him. Jacob responds to this by offering to make God a deal. In Genesis chapter 28, verse 20 to 25, he says this, "If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey that I'm taking, if he will give me food to eat and clothes to wear so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God. And this stone that I've set up as a pillar here will be called God's house. And of all that you give me," he's now talking to God, "of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth." Earlier in talking to his father when he brought him the meal, he spoke of God as your God, not my God, your God. Now he offers God a proposition. God, you do this for me, and I will do this for you. But little did Jacob know that this was the beginning of a 20-year wilderness journey for him. A time in which he would be forced to struggle with an uncle named Laban, who was every bit as deceitful as he was, and who sought to take advantage of Jacob even more than Jacob had taken advantage of his brother or of his father. Over those 20 years, Laban took advantage of Jacob in several different ways. First, he promised his beautiful younger daughter Rachel to Jacob in marriage in exchange for Jacob working for him for 7 years. At the end of the 7 years, I'll give you my daughter. So after 7 years, on the day in which he was to give him his daughter, he gave him instead his oldest daughter, who was not as good looking, named Leah. When he came upset to him and said, "Why did you give me Leah?" he says, "Well, we have a custom here. You have to marry the older daughter first. It wouldn't be right otherwise. So I tell you what, you have your honeymoon week with Leah, and then if you will work another 7 years for me, then I will give you Rachel as well." It was kind of a bait and switch. This deception alone ended up causing tremendous turmoil for Jacob, as these two sisters, now co-wives, competed with one another for his affections. They seemed to think that the one who produced the most sons would then be loved the most by Jacob. In fact, it's kind of sad. They even made deals with one another about who had the right to sleep with him. They didn't ask who he wanted to sleep with. They said, "Okay, it's my turn. If you do this for me, you give me this, then I'll let you sleep with him." Like he's a piece of meat to be traded. And despite all that he tried to do, Jacob could not in his own efforts bring peace between these two women. After the 14 years were up, Laban made an additional agreement with Jacob about a way that Jacob could build up his own flocks of sheep and goats. But as Jacob would point out at the end of those 6 years, that over those past 6 years, Laban changed the terms of the agreement 10 times. He changed his wages 10 times. Each time he changed the contract to his advantage and to Jacob's disadvantage. And when Jacob finally had enough and took off with his wives, his children, and his livestock, Laban came after him with a posse, claiming that everyone and everything that Jacob had with him belonged to him. He's the foreigner. These all belong to me. Through this long wilderness journey, we see God refining and reforming Jacob. And the question is, how did he do that? To begin with, when Jacob least deserved it, God spoke a blessing out over Jacob, saying in Genesis chapter 28, verses 13 to 15, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you're lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done all that I have promised you. He blessed him when he didn't deserve a blessing. Later, when Laban kept changing the terms of their agreement, each time God blessed Jacob instead. He increased Jacob's flocks. When Laban said, okay, I'll take these sheep, then God blessed the other sheep that were left over for Jacob. And when Laban came in hot pursuit, intending to harm Jacob, God warned Laban in a dream, telling him in Genesis chapter 31, verse 24, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, whether good or bad. So real was this warning to Laban in his dream that despite his bluster, Laban backed down, trying to save face a little bit, but he made a deal with Jacob that would secure both of their futures and make sure that neither of them hurt the other. The pinnacle of Jacob's struggle comes when, all alone in Genesis chapter 32, Jacob wrestles all night. We're told with a man, and then later it seems with God himself, that he said to him, I will not let you go unless you bless me. In the process of the struggling, the person who he was wrestling with touched his hip and put it out of joint. But after he said this, then God blessed Jacob and changed his name from Jacob the deceiver to Israel, which means he struggles with God, because Jacob had finally broken through, though he was left with a limp for the rest of his life, perhaps a memory of when he had wrestled with God. It's in Genesis chapter 31 to 33 that we see the result of the refining work of God in Jacob's life. First of all, we see it in Jacob's forthright response to Laban. When Laban came and he said, look, you did this against me, he didn't say, but I won. He said, he didn't take the credit himself. He said, no, God worked on my behalf and he made me successful despite your attempts to mistreat me. Secondly, we see the change in Jacob in his humble cry for help to God when he heard that Esau was coming with 400 men. Instead of scheming to do as he'd done in the past, he acknowledged to God in chapter 32, verse 10, Lord, I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you've shown to your servant. He goes on to tell him, God, I'm afraid, and he expresses his trust in God's promises. This is a whole different Jacob. Then thirdly, we see his change in his humble approach to his brother Esau. Though Isaac, in his blessing of Jacob back in chapter 27, had said that the nations would serve Jacob and that people, including his brothers, would bow down to him, in Genesis chapter 33, verse 3 and following, we see Jacob bowing down to Esau. We see him calling him my Lord and referring to himself as your servant. Finally, we see Jacob honoring his promise. Jacob didn't try to get out of the promise that he'd made to God. Instead, he acknowledged God's saving presence with him, and he called on his whole family and all those who were with him to join him in worshiping the one true God. Have you found yourself struggling in the midst of this COVID-19 wilderness, whether with yourself or with others, or maybe even with God himself? Have you been trying to overcome these struggles in your own strength? Jacob's story assures us that God is present with us and can even use the toughest struggles in our lives, in our wilderness, to refine us and to reform us if we will let Him. Though we may not feel that we deserve His help or His love because of things we've done maybe to other people, as with Jacob, God meets us to bless us. In fact, in the New Testament, in Romans chapter 5, verse 8, the Apostle Paul assures us that God demonstrated His own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, in other words, while we were at our very worst, that's when Jesus Christ laid down His life for us. We learn that no matter what others seek to do to hurt us, God is able to work all things together for our good and to ultimately bless us in spite of their attempts to work to the contrary. In other words, we don't have to fight other people in our own strength. We can trust God to deal with them in the proper time, in the proper way. Finally, no matter what our name or our reputation has been, whether to ourselves or to others around us, God is able to bless us, as we learn from Jacob, and to give us a new name, a new identity in Him. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17, again in the New Testament, it assures us that anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old life is gone. A new life has begun. If we will allow God to refine and to reform us in this current crucible brought on by COVID-19, Jacob assures us that we will come out as pure gold. And that is the good news.